conversation with Frank LaRose, or finished that conversation rather, Marcell Strbich reached out again and said, we've got to do more than that, and there are things we can do. So let's welcome Marcell back to the program. Marcell Strbich is a leading contributor and constituent advocate for HB-472, the Ohio Votes Count Act. Marcell, welcome back to the program. Good to have you back. How are you?
Absolutely. Good morning to you and your audience. Great to be here.
So let's start with your reaction. You sent me a couple of notes after the conversation that I had with Frank LaRose last week, and my response to you was, hey, he does have a point. If we can't get federal database information, we can't really make sure that everything is in line with respect to Ohio voters and the voter rolls. But you pushed back on that a little bit. Tell me more.
Well, he has a point, and he is correct. It would be extraordinarily helpful to start to gain access like other states have had now for several years, Virginia, Florida, and I believe he's moving us in that direction, and that's a good thing. Now, with that said, when we're talking about this issue of the potential for non-citizens to register and vote, then what HB-472, which, by the way, has a proponent testimony now scheduled, I believe, for Wednesday at 11 o'clock with the Homeland Security Committee, so we'll have an opportunity to make our case before Ohioans, many Ohioans making that case at the constituency level. But what we can do is we can start to address this question of how are we going to address this from May through November, right? So the annual non-citizen audit, which is performed and done in the spring time frame, has allowed us to understand that we've had up to 137 non-citizens. Now, when you look at the fine print on that, we have a law here that is Section 3503.152, right, which is non-citizen database, right? And so what that is limited by is restricted by the criteria that it uses for that screening process for the Secretary of State. For example, Bob, and this is why we think more can be done. The third criteria states that a non-citizen has to go on 2 separate occasions and submit source documentation to the Board of Motor Vehicles. Now, in what reason or compelling point would they do that? Would they come to this Board of Motor Vehicles twice when you look at the fact that they've already got their documentation? So we think that third component is unnecessary and highly restrictive, and if that would be revised, then the likelihood of being able to actually uncover greater amounts of non-applicants is there. But even with that said...
And that's included in 472, Marcell? That's included? Yeah. That would be included in 472? It would eliminate that requirement?
What 472 does is it allows for monthly checks of non-citizens. Now, the Secretary of State doesn't need 472 to work with the Board of Motor Vehicles. To your point, they have authoritative data on non-citizens that produce documentation to them. So by simply applying in the interim solution between May and November, and this is what we hope the Secretary of State moves to do, as he's been very proactive in announcing additional steps, and we hope he'll continue to do that, is he can go in and ask for those monthly checks, cross-check them for the voter database, and if he finds applicants that have registered that happen to be non-citizens, he can flag them for provisional status. And if they're in provisional status, that means, according to our law, that they cannot vote by mail-in absentee ballot. And I think that's the biggest susceptible area. They would have to go in person and present their photo ID and have a poll worker check that ID. So that would be one very important step that may cut off the potential for witting or unwitting fraud of non-citizen vote going into 2022.
Okay, that is huge, and it would, absolutely right. If there's a question about somebody, make them come in and cast a provisional ballot in person and showing their ID. I don't disagree with that at all. This is all part of HB 472, right?
Right. HB 472 has a series of other provisions that verifies and determines the eligibility using reference lists. That's an important concept. The County Board of Elections that process all paper registrations that come from state agencies or people who come in person, they lack the ability up front to examine for driver's licenses or last four social security number. So a lot of that reference list exists at the Secretary of State through his Board of Motor Vehicles and his checks that he does between the Board of Motor Vehicles. So the key is to expand those accesses and methods down to the county level. And what we found is that there's going to be a substantial cost savings, and that was what one of the opponents, opponents of the bill have said. Well, you're placing an undue burden on administrators. Well, when you look at that, we've created 700 precincts for example, because we've kept 700,000 voter records in our databases for over 6+ years. Now, I know we're cleaning some of that up, but perennially we never clean up the several hundred thousand. We clean it up to the tune of tens of thousands, and those numbers quickly return each and every time. So we're addressing the real issue, which is to, on an upfront basis, determine the eligibility before we place invalid or ineligible people onto our voter rate databases through this bill.
So, Marcell, two things come to mind here, both of them with respect to timing. Knowing the pace of legislation in this state, is anything going to be done by the end of the summer with 472? I know you said there's proponent testimony coming. I don't know exactly how long it would take to get this thing to a floor vote in the House and get it through the Senate and get it signed and so forth. And by the way, Mike DeWine, to my understanding, and I brought this up with LaRose, doesn't seem to have much of an appetite to do anything more than has already been done to secure the voter rolls in this state.
Well, certainly the actions are in motion in the House, and there's also discussions going on in the Senate. But my point in bringing squaring the situation is, we've had the national debate come out, and it said, they're downplaying this as a non-issue, that this is something that Republicans are coming up with this year once again so they can contest the 2024 election. And they're using the good effort of our Secretary of State to build out their narrative. And what I think we need to do is we need to recognize that it is a difficult environment, legislatively speaking, for a number of reasons, to compile and get this in through November. But we can also pivot on this most critical issue of citizenship identity verification. And we can score a big win with that through the assertion of effort by the Secretary of State if he changes to a monthly status check, and he also is able to flag for provisional purposes.
So changing to a monthly status check, changing to a monthly status check, though, is something, are you saying that he can do unilaterally, or would that have to be a part of that 472?
He sets wide latitude. The law in Ohio gives him wide latitude to work information sharing agreements with the Board of Motor Vehicles. If he says, I want to know all surrendered driver's licenses, the Board of Motor Vehicles, which is important because that signifies somebody's left the state, somebody's living somewhere else, they've surrendered, in effect, their eligibility, their residence eligibility. That's one of the 5 criteria. So he can do that. He can check more often. Just because the law says he has to do an annual non-audit doesn't mean he cannot. He's restricted from doing more. Okay. Clearly, his hands are bound, and he appropriately stated that in some respect to federal and state law. But why that law was written for a non-citizen to have to present themselves twice on 2 separate occasions and source documentation is, I think, the real mystery and hint as to whether we're going to truly get clarity if it's just 100 or if we're talking thousands. And I know that we brought that forward as well for legislators to look at it and ask those fundamental questions.
Well, the second question I had regarding timing, again, at first I brought up the pace of getting legislation through, and then secondly, it's less time than we even think, because you said May through November, those monthly checks. What the Secretary told me last week was that he can only do anything through the first week of August, 90 days before the actual election. After that, he can't do anything with any registration whatsoever, if I understood him correctly. So we're 10 days away from June right now. So we have the rest of May. If this thing got passed tomorrow, which it won't, we got June and July, and pretty much that's it in order to try to clean up any non-citizens and get them off of the voter rolls.
And Bob, that's why I say pivot, because he's correct. He can't remove voter record files for a federal election after August 7th, but that doesn't mean that he can't flag them. He's the one that determines the eligibility status. That's the big
so between August 7th and November 7th, you're saying he can not unregister anybody, but he can flag them and make sure they only cast provisional ballots. You're saying he can do that
if
unilaterally.
He determines that the eligibility criteria, which is what's required under the National Voter Registration Act, our law, our Constitution, yes, they can be put in an eligibility status that doesn't that in effect will not remove them. But he has a right, and the state has a right, to determine the eligibility status for those that vote.
So
and that is why we're bringing this up as an interim solution in the event that the legislature is not able to pass the critical provisions within HB 472.
Got it. Now it's making a lot more sense. So we're talking about a couple of different things here. We're talking about things that the Secretary himself can do now with respect to the BMV and assigning provisional status to those who are questionable and so forth. 472 is different. It's not different. I mean, the goal here is the same, of course, to make sure that we have secure elections. But the stuff that you're asking the Secretary to do is not necessarily the same things that are being included in the legislation, and one can be done without the other.
Right, and that's what I'm saying, Bob. He has purview over that. He's the chief election administration official. If he wants information, he can get that information from the Board of Motor Vehicles. They do a very good job of compiling it. In many cases, they're even better than some states in the way they do it. And from what we understand, they've explained to us, we pass this information over to the Secretary of State, and what the Secretary of State does with it is a question for the Secretary of State, and we're asking the same question.
So being such a proponent of HB-472, but if you just turned us on, we're talking to Marcell Strbich. He is a leading contributor and constituent advocate for HB-472. That's the Ohio Votes Count Act. You said a moment or two ago that the attitude in the general in the media and in national circles is this is just a Republican talking point, that the elections aren't fair, and when they lose they complain, blah blah blah, and so this is probably not a big deal. It feels like, as I said to you a moment ago, Mike DeWine seems to share that view. He was asked about, I don't know if it was specifically about 472, but he was asked about further efforts to clean up the voter rolls to make sure non-citizens don't vote. And he said, basically, I've signed enough. We've done enough here to make sure that the elections are right, that we do have voter ID requirements and so forth. I don't need to be signing anything else. That's a paraphrase. But does it seem to you like even if the GA got its act together, it's not something that Mike DeWine would sign?
I think that the variables in 472 are a lot different. There's the blockchain digital ledger component that secures our voter records and creates a history of any changes that were made to them to prevent any alteration. There's that feature. There's the security assessment review feature that requires a third party to apply military grade level standards that go back for a vendor who's trying to certify a voting system in our state to actually disclose their software development practices, their foreign ownership control and influence. That level of transparency is unprecedented. And I would just add that it is the governor that signed the HB-52 bill in 2019, which created the Ohio Cyber Reserve Defense Forces, which became the pillar of what many other states don't have, which is a credentialed cybersecurity all-volunteer force that answers to the Attorney General and the governor. So for the governor, this would be a prime opportunity to mature that capability and have, as our sponsor Bernie Willis stated in his May 1st testimony, which is very good testimony, recommend anybody interested in this bill listen to that testimony on Ohio's site. He broke it down and said we have a defense force that is more reactive in posture. This would create a more proactive posture, and we would bring in real private industry, independent folks to do that level of analysis. And we'll be presenting that on Wednesday, and we'll be showing the cost-benefit analysis to doing that.
Yeah, and those are all very, very valid points, and I'm glad to hear them. But like I said, my concern is that does Mike DeWine agree? That everything you just said, I don't have a problem with. There's no disagreement here. But here's the quote I was talking about. I found it. The burden of proof, this is from May 10th, so a week ago or so. The burden of proof is on those who say we need to change the law. When I signed the last reform bill, I said as far as I was concerned, we were done. If there's new facts that come up or new problems that come up, then we can look at it. And then he was referencing 458 that you just mentioned as well. So, he basically sounds like he's going to have to be really, really convinced if the GA gets something passed out of both sides in order for him to sign it. I don't know why. I mean, I could just sit here and cast aspersions and say it's because he's a rhino and he doesn't want to tick off the Democrats any more than he already has with anything else. But if we don't have the governor on our side, then we get ourselves into a situation where we have the same thing we did with the SAFE Act. Will there be enough momentum to override a veto if he does indeed decide he isn't going to sign this or decide to veto it outright?
It's fair. I mean, new facts are presented here all throughout this bill. New approaches, first-in-the-nation type landmark approach to addressing all facets of it. The bill even affords counties the right, doesn't institute it, but it affords counties the right to decide for themselves if they want to choose or opt in to non-electronic means of casting and tabulating. And that's a very important self-determination and autonomy that is necessary for that degree of confidence to be restored on a certain level. And I think counties should have a right to make that call, right? We're a bottom-up election system. Certain likely rural counties will be interested in that provision. It is very expensive to maintain election equipment infrastructure. It cycles out about every 10 years. It's a big bill. And, there's a lot of questions as to people after they leave the voting booth, they have to presume that this information was processed in the way that they wished or they inputted it into the system. There's a lot of things they can do to have a greater clarity on that. It would probably drive more people back into this system if they had the ability to see it.
So while proponent testimony is being heard on 472, your goal is to have Secretary of State LaRose also implementing the non-citizen voter checks that we're talking about, and putting people into provisional status if there is some question as to their legal registration, right?
That would be very powerful. I think he has recently assumed the role as the head of Secretaries of State for all Republicans in the country.
Yes, he has.
I think that would just be yet another example for him to lay out in terms of the extra steps that Ohio is taking. Of course, he has good advisors, and he's in charge of the situation. He can best determine how to do that, but it would certainly go over very well with many of us who are fighting to support him with this bill and future Secretaries of State.
All right. Marcell Strbich, really, really good educational conversation here. I think we learned a lot about 472 and, of course, what we're asking for the Secretary to do as well. They are not joint. These are two different things. And the Secretary can have a direct impact on making sure that non-citizens do not vote this November if he does undertake the month-by-month verification process between now and then. And even after we get into that 90-day period, you can flag people for provisional status. I think all of those are fair things to do. Do you have meetings or conversations with the Secretary, you and your organization and like-minded individuals? Any reach that you guys have?
At this time, we're all very much focused on the proponent testimony, so we are not, I personally am not in conversation with. I know members of our group have in the past been in conversation with him. We fully expect him to be kind of gearing up the whole system as he gets ready. So we would welcome those type of conversations as we go forward, but I hope to hear more from him in the ideas that have been put forward and if he thinks they're feasible. And we thank him for his continued diligence as he works to get our state ready and have a big election in 2024.
Is there, I apologize, I may have asked you this already before, is there a companion bill on the Senate side or just the 472 on the House side?
There right now is not officially a companion bill. There are a couple other bills that have sprung up in the House as well, one for watermark paper ballots. I can talk a little bit about that at some point later as we get more information. And there's another one that also uses the flagging of provisional status if it's been determined that these valid or questionable records, which are still waiting confirmation status back, letters that have been sent out. So a lot can be done, again, in that area, and that's why I came on today. And I thank you so much for giving us the time for the constituents of Ohio, and I hope everybody who's available and interested can plug into our testimony and learn about Ohio's election systems.
It's important. It is absolutely important. I completely concur. Well, it's good to have you. Thank you for the information and the education you brought. We will continue to stay in touch with you and learn more about this. So, Marcell, thank you so much for the time.
Have a wonderful day. Bye.
You too. That's Marcell Strbich. It's 10:27. We'll take a time out here. I'm looking at the status, by the